My name is Aaron Crawford. It is June 12th or June 11th, 2014. I'm here with
Great start.
A mistake in the very first moment. So we're here today with Mr. Fred Fielding. I would like to start out a little bit about your background. You've been in the White House counsel's office 3 times.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit about what that office does and maybe how it changed between the first and second time you were there?
Well, it really changed between the first and second time I was there, much more than between the second and third time I was there, because the first time I was there, first of all, I went in as a staff lawyer and ended up being deputy, but it was in a whole different environment. But your question is, how did it change? Every White House is different, and it depends on the president. It depends on the structure. And each White House has its own personality. But as far as the counsel's office goes, it's really different because it really depends upon your relationship with the president and what he is expecting of the White House counsel. The Nixon administration was unique in my experience because, if you will recall, my first boss was John Dean. But John Dean was 32 years old, and he had replaced and been brought in to replace the counsel of the president, who was a gentleman named John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman was a really powerful person in that White House. He didn't choose to have a really powerful person succeed him. It became evident, and much more so as I look back than I did at the time. So they picked John Dean, who was a relatively obscure Justice Department junior lawyer over in the Deputy Attorney General's office. This, by way of saying, my view of the White House and my view of the staff structure was fashioned by that experience. So I was a young lawyer in an office that had clearly been downgraded. The office had moved. The council had moved from the West Wing over to the old executive office building, et cetera. I mean, all these little things that do mean something in White House criminology, so to speak. So my view was different. I was young. I had never been in government before in an executive position. And so my view was fashioned by that. But it was also, candidly, the way the President Nixon operated. He had a very strict, tight group of people that he talked to. And I don't think I was ever, I know I was never in a one-on-one meeting with him. I was never in a two-on-one meeting with him, just group meetings and things like that. Whereas in the Bush administration, George W. Bush 43, and in the Ronald Reagan administration, I was counsel to the president. And each of them, again, was different and unique. Different, especially if you recall, when Reagan came in, he had 3 very top close aides. 2 of the 3 were lawyers. So right away you have a system where you have counsel the president, but you also had 2 very close advisors who were also lawyers. One of them had been his counsel when he was governor. Plus, they knew him better than I did. I basically didn't know the president except from working in the transition when he was governor and then president-elect. So I had to come in, and we had to develop a relationship while I was still developing a relationship with the other staff members as well. Jump forward to the George W. Bush administration. I knew almost all of the senior people over the years. I certainly knew them all after the transition because I ran the transition and had to clear them all. So I knew them very well and knew about them very well. I knew George W. Bush before he was governor because he was the son of the vice president. And then I had chatted with him and met with him when he was governor, but I'd never worked with him. And then I, again, was tapped to run his transition. And so had worked with him there, but that I didn't go in right in the beginning. but nonetheless, I knew him in a different way than I knew Ronald Reagan. And also, I was older than the president at that time, which is, you know, a funny feeling as you go into different iterations. So that, by way of background, is how the council, in my instance, looked at the boss, so to speak. Now, what does the office do? It's hard to describe it. I used to describe the White House counsel's office when I was in the Reagan administration. When I first there, I used to say it was like being the air traffic controller. When he decided to fire all the air traffic controllers, I changed that. I didn't use that description anymore. But there again, the office, if you understand it, really is like being the air traffic controller. It's the crisis management point from the legal point of view of the White House operation. The counsel of the president is counsel to the presidency, to the institution of the presidency. But over the years, it's now become known as the White House counsel, not the counsel of the president, because that's your little immediate constituent group is the White House staff. But in addition to that, you have to be the arbiter, basically, of legal disputes between general counsels, departments, and agencies. You have to be the clearance process for legal issues as they go into the policy development stage. And this is very important and has to be set up and should be set up right in the beginning, you are the conduit and the only conduit to the Department of Justice from the White House staff, with the exception of, you know, ministerial type things. And that has to be set up and should be set up right in the beginning when you go in, so that you avoid the obvious problem of some political guy or gal that wants to do a political favor or needs to know some information. Prevents them from calling directly the White House, from the White House to the Department of Justice, in what could be unfairly, of course, interpreted as influence, exerting influence on the justice process. So that's one of your conduits. You have some fixed, the office has fixed responsibilities like pardons and clearances and a series of things. Again, some of it depending on the structure of the White House, but most of it now evolving into almost an institutional basis. I'm rambling a little here, and I hope that's
I think
not
you're
a field
actually
from what you want. But you know, you have to understand that also the White House counsel's office and the counsel of the president is what the president wants it to be. But in addition to these fixed responsibilities, I would start to say, I think that since the Reagan administration, the office is institutionalized. It really has become institutionalized because at that point when we started out, we issued conflicts of interest memos. We issued a whole series of memos instructing the standards of conduct and informing the standards of conduct for the staff itself. And of course, it trickles down to the executive branch. So I think now it is institutionalized, although it's never provided for by statute or anything like that. Structurally, if this is instructive to you, structurally, the White House hierarchy of staff people are all assistants to the president. It doesn't make sense, but in Washington, where you hear of people that are counsels and special counsels and this kind of counsel and that kind of counsel, most of them you don't want to meet. The counsel of the president is an assistant to the president. His deputies are deputy assistants to the president, and then the staff people are either commissioned or not commissioned, as the case may be. But the reason I'm saying that hierarchy is that that's the only legal basis for your White House staff. So your chief of staff, which is certainly the first among equals, is an assistant to the president. So is the press secretary. People that have other titles also are assistants to the president. And And yet, when you have a senior staff meeting every morning, it's always run differently depending on the chief of staff, but they usually go around and they'll call on people and they're all assistants to the president. And so the congressional liaison reports, and then the press secretary reports, and then this one and that one around the table. But, and I'm only saying this because that's the only legal structure that you have for a White House staff.
That's actually maybe the best explanation that I've heard of the structure of the White House.
Yeah.
Well, because we are really interested in judicial nominations, and I think a lot of people within the Bush administration consider his staffing of the courts, one of his real legacies. I want to ask you about your experience the previous two times with court nominations, both appellate and Supreme Court. What was your experience in the Nixon and Reagan White House? What did you play any role in any of those?
Okay, that's a good starting point, because again, remember I talked about there being fixed responsibilities. That's now one of the fixed responsibilities. There's been an evolution, if I can play to your historical side for a minute. There's been an evolution in that there's always a tension between the Justice Department and the White House about judicial nominees, and especially between the Justice Department and the Counsel of the President's office. In the Nixon administration, basically judicial selection, as far as I knew, was something between the Justice Department and the Deputy Attorney General and the President and John Ehrlichman. I mean, Justice Department said, here's the guys that are going to be, or the gals that are going to be for the federal district court, for instance. That's the way it was done. The White House wasn't involved. Again, everything is different depending on the president. But even, I'm trying to think, I guess the only involvement I recall with the judiciary selection side in the Nixon administration was the Supreme Court picks, and this was after the Carswell-Haynesworth mess. And John Dean was dispatched with another non-counsel office person to go interview various people and report back, because the president and the White House was taking an involvement, as you would assume, of course, with the Supreme Court. But that was basically it. I did a symposia for the Nixon people, and we did an hour of the Nixon legacy leading from the Rehnquist court and all that kind of stuff. But I remember thinking at the time when we were starting it, we filled the hour, but I wasn't sure we were going to be able to fill the hour because of the minor involvement of the White House as opposed to in judiciary generally. But of course, Supreme Court is big stuff, and it certainly was with President Nixon, and it is with every president. You said that George W. Bush, a lot of people say that's his strongest legacy. I would say every presidency, that is probably one of the most important legacies, for good or for ill, that a president leaves behind, because it's the one that actually surpasses their tenure, so to speak. I mean, it shapes the court. Okay, fast forward, if I may, to the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan, Governor Reagan, had been very disappointed in some of the appointments that he made in the California court system. And so when he came to office, we had a meeting, myself and Jim Baker and Ed Meese, and he let it be known, and I don't think the Attorney General was in on that meeting, but he just let it be known that he wanted the White House to be involved in judicial selection. So we theoretically, had that charge. What I set up was a judicial selection meeting when we met every week, and there were representatives, the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, the head of Office of Legal Policy, and one other person, I can't think who it was, from the Justice Department, would meet with myself, and several other assistants to the president. And I had one or two staff people just for recording purposes. And that's where the judicial selection debate took place. But it was in the White House because that's what Reagan wanted. He wanted to get it in where he felt that he had better control over it. And we set up guidelines. For instance, we would ask each senator from a home state to give us 3 to 5 names for any vacancy. And for the courts of appeals, there are some that are deemed to be kind of the Missouri seat or the Ohio seat within a circuit. That was acknowledged, but not necessarily honored. And we told the senators that they were the presidents. And if he wanted to have everybody from Pennsylvania, he was going to have everybody from Pennsylvania, the Third Circuit, or whatever. 3 to 5 names for each vacancy. Now, depending on the senator, we always got 3 to 5 names. But if it was a certain senator or two, we got them one at a time. But he said, I'll give you 5 names, but I'm only going to give them to you one at a time. Because, they knew who they wanted. But by the same token, we would reject people if we didn't think that they were up to what the president wanted, or if they were purely political maneuvers by the senators. We would not abide that. But we took input from the political people. We took input from everybody that we could. If there wasn't a senator in a particular state that was Republican, we would take it from the Congress people. If they were Republican, we would take it from the party leaders. We'd take names, but the decisions were made in the White House. Now you say, well, okay, that's the way things are done, but it wasn't the way things were done, is what I'm trying to tell you. That was the turning point as far as my observation. I was on a Miller Center committee that looked at streamlining the judiciary as far as the selection process went, and found out, and this was obviously after I had left, and this was after the Reagan administration had ended. And I was surprised to find that the clash had picked up again. And they basically had 2 selection groups. One was in the Justice Department, and one head by, what was her name? L.D. Atchison, I believe. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And one in the White House. So there had been this competing issue again between who initiated the selections. So that was in the Democrat administration. By the time I went back in to the George W. Bush administration, it was 6 years in. They had a very similar system to what we had in the Reagan administration. And I had long talks with Al Gonzalez, because he had one who set it up, and we had talked about that during the transition. And I talked with Harriet Myers and got the lay of the land. And she had involved a lot of the junior lawyers in this. We're talking about the Bush administration now. A lot of junior lawyers that were on her staff, and each of them would have kind of a circuit or a this or that be their responsibility. So I tried to keep that as much as I could since it was in place, but I had replaced a lot of her staff. So we just tried to keep the structure the same. And we also knew when I went back into the Bush 43 that we had lost control of the Senate and the House. So we knew that these were going to be more difficult times to get people confirmed, because the last 2 years, there were political practicalities we had to deal with. There also were some historic log jams. For instance, Carl Levin had held up anything. What was that be? That would be is that the Fifth Circuit? I believe it is. Anyway, they'd had a log jam for 5 years, something. So I would take upon myself to go up and negotiate with him to try to, and we found a way to break the logjam. And it's horse trading in a certain extent, but it was important to break the logjam so that we didn't have this horrible situation of 5-year vacancies and that sort of thing. Okay, so now that's the framework. Now, be specific in your question, if any.
With a lot of the people that we've talked to who were there at the beginning, who actually seemed to have set up a really efficient system, had an idea of how they were going to nominate people, actually even before the inauguration. It seemed very efficient. They had nominees ready to go very quickly after that. But there were these log jams with the Senate. And, we read a lot that particularly the Senate said that they believed they were losing some of their advisory power on these issues. Explain a little bit about why those log jams happened, because a lot of the people in the Democratic Party would argue and did argue that this was their responsibility, but you're seeing a sort of unprecedented holdup over ideological reasons.
Well, that's the problem, and it's not unique to Democrats or the Republicans. Right. I mean, whoever is frustrated when they're trying to make appointments, there's usually an equal number of people that are frustrated by the other side of the party because they think that it's a runaway and the people that are going in are totally unacceptable to them, although they don't happen to have the White House at the time. So there are, but some of these log jams, like the one with Carl Lemon, it made no sense at all. It was just like so many things in politics. It's almost like Serbian villages where you shoot somebody because somebody massacred your great uncle 130 years ago. I mean, it's just these old wounds that people talk about all the time, and some of it's that way. I mean, some of that's part of some of the problem.
Well, we've heard from some people, and we've read that many Democrats considered those first 2 years of the Bush administration time for payback.
Yeah,
because of issues in the Clinton.
Because the people had blocked the Clinton appointees,
particularly Ronnie White, who's now kind of back in the.
I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
Actually, now I think has made it to the court under Obama. So, I mean, is it really that simple? Is it's just sort of?
Well, some of it is. It's that simple's a nice word, a polite word for it. But some of it is just that bad. But a lot of it is tactical pressure to try to make sure that you don't put in somebody that's totally wild ideologically. And the president has a lot of pressure to do that. And I hate to sound partisan, but I mean, George W. Bush was not that way at all. And it just used to annoy him when people would kind of accuse him, saying historically, you blocked my guy, so I'm going to block your guy, because he wasn't that way in his selections. He didn't take ideological, what you'd call a wing nut. He didn't. He wanted a solid judiciary, and Ronald Reagan did too, for that matter. I mean, Reagan had a tough task when he started because he really. There were a lot of vacancies, and we were a little slow getting out of the box because we had some difficulty with our side up on the Senate. Whereas by the time I came in to George W. Bush administration, it had just switched. We had just lost the Senate. And so we knew it was going to be very tough, and yet we knew we had to get some of these appointments made. And part of doing that was to break some of these log jams that historically had existed long beyond anybody remembering why they were.
Well, one of the other things that you often hear is that many of these the stalled nominations on the appellate court, the first Bush term, it was all a practice for the inevitable Supreme Court nominee. And I know that you weren't in the administration yet, but I mean, how had that process changed between, the time, I guess, in the Reagan White House, you'd worked on the probably even the Bork nomination.
Yeah.
So
Actually, I worked on the Bork nomination after I left the White House.
okay.
The irony of that, and it always strikes me so funny. Sandra Day O'Connor was our first, in the Reagan administration, was our first Supreme Court justice. And the dynamics of that, I could take a half hour. The different people with inputs, like the Chief Justice, and everything. But that being aside, we knew that there were several people that were obviously going to be candidates to be appointed. One of them was Nino Scalia. One was Robert Bork. And so we went back and forth and decided that we would go with Scalia first because he would be more controversial than Bork, just to show you how brilliant we were. But and so that's why that was ordered that way. And of course, it didn't turn out that way because Robert Bork made himself very controversial.
Well, you bring up O'Connor. I mean, it strikes me that in some ways this had been sort of, Carter never had the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice, and Stevens had been the last one. So I assume a lot of people hadn't been through that process on either side in a while.
That's right.
So
that's right. And I must say that the Justice Department was very involved, as were we, on the O'Connor nomination, as were we in the White House. They were very involved, and they did a majority of the vetting, and that's, we sat in on the murder boards, and I sat in on the murder boards. But William French Smith had assigned a fellow who was one of his staffers named Kenneth Starr, and that was Starr's responsibility, was to shepherd to put all the pieces together. So it was kind of funny.
So, well, I mean, when you hear these, people who were in those first 4 years saying that they were preparing for that Supreme Court fight, they always mention Bork and, of course, Thomas. So it seemed to be sort of an escalation in expectations that George W. Bush was going to nominate.
Oh yeah.
This, and I think there's also a lot of fear that Miguel Estrada, placed on an appellate court, would eventually be the nominee. I mean, is it? I mean, from what you understand, is that the case?
Oh, well, Estrada was blocked clearly because of his potential to go on the Supreme Court. I mean, I went up and testified in his behalf before an investigative committee of the Senate, including Senator Obama, who, asked questions about whether this was good to have balance on the Supreme Court and this sort of stuff. It was a silly hearing, but it was aimed at clearly trying to block Estrada. And
well, I mean, how do you explain? Clinton had two Supreme Court nominees that seemingly they sailed through, and we talked to Mr. Gray yesterday, who talked about how they had allowed their appellate court nominations to go forward at the end of the Carter administration at a time when normally that would not happen.
That's right.
So it can maybe seems to be more of an imbalance in the way this works. And of course, President Obama has had no trouble with his Supreme Court nominees.
No, but he hasn't sent up anybody that was just a bomb thrower either. I mean, if everyone, the Democrats thought that Estrada was the devil incarnate. I don't know off the top of my head who they might think was the same on the Democrat side right now, but I'm sure we could come up with Elizabeth Warren or somebody like that everyone would say, she can't possibly do.
Well, what's so frightening to them about Estrada? What was so frightening about Estrada to them?
He was very conservative. And actually, He's very conservative, and yet I always thought that they were running a horrendous risk, but they got away with it. And that risk was that they would alienate the Hispanic community and I thought, and the minority community. I really thought it was a very silly, high-risk thing. I was a little prejudiced because at the time I was not in government, but at the time I was in the ABA Standing Committee on the Judiciary, and he was one of my clearances that I did the investigation for, and that committee is no right-wing committee at all. I mean, it's the history of it.
Yeah.
It's pretty liberal group, and they asked me to go on, and I said, I don't think I am going to. And they said, well, why not? And I said, because it's ideological, and I'm not going to just go on and sign on to an ideological committee. And they said, well, no, it's not a new chairman. So we made a deal that I would go on, and if I thought that it was ideological, I was going to resign. And I wouldn't resign publicly, but if anybody asked me why I resigned, I was going to tell them. So that was our little deal. But I had Estrada as one of my clearances, and I wrote a recommendation, and it was unanimous by the ABA Standing Committee supporting him, which really got lost in the wash when his name came up. But that was what it was. It was just they were afraid he would ultimately go on the Supreme Court.
Well, that seems kind of ironic. You bring up the ABA because,
Yeah.
I mean, the Bush administration caught heat when they stopped sending those nominations ahead.
That's right.
And I haven't yet kind of heard a really good explanation about why they did that.
They decided to do it. Well, I'll give you my explanation. And it was confirmed by Al Gonzalez. Somebody came up with that and one of the things we're going to do is we're going to do away with the damn pre-clearance by the ABA. This was factionalism during the campaign. And that was one of the things that they announced. And nobody ever asked any questions beyond that. And that became their policy. And I said, I remember during transition, I talked to Al Gonzalez about it. And I said, you're making a mistake. I wasn't on the committee. And I said, you're making a mistake. You need the ABA because they will clear out people that you want to be cleared out and that for political reasons are being pushed. And so they will give you a buffer. And in addition to that, if it turns into a charade, then stop it. But don't go into it with not using it. And Al told me that the decision had been made during the campaign, and afterward, a lot of people wanted to rethink it, but they just, they already put their toe in the water, and they'd satisfied some group by saying they wouldn't do it. That's my version of why.
Well, let me kind of switch gears for a second because
Yeah.
you brought it up several times, and because you're talking about working on clearances for the ABA and of course in the counsel's office. You have cleared thousands of people
Yes.
for jobs throughout the government. You probably know more about everybody in working in the government at this point. So
That's why I'm not writing a book.
well, that's another question I have for later. But why? Explain exactly what goes into clearing someone for I guess any office. I mean, not just a judicial nominee. I mean,
Okay, this is a complete switch from where we're going, but
Yeah,
I'd be
I'm
happy
just-
to do it. Yeah. Everybody does it differently. I was brought in to do the transition for George W. Bush because if you will recall historically, and of course you live it so you know, we had a very, very short time fuse on transition. And so I was asked, what should we do? And I set up, and I said, look, I'll set up a hit squad. I'm going to bring in some old guys from the gang that can't shoot straight that I worked with over the years. We'll set up a team, and I'll personally vet the people. And we set it up, and it's ironic when you think about it, because usually you're coming into government. I give you 1,000 forms, you fill them out, including your financial forms, your personal data statements, and your FBI background stuff. personal data statement questionnaire. I wrote the first one after Bill Casey's nomination for the SEC in the Nixon administration. And it's basically the same questionnaire. It's just handed down, and Boyden put his name on it and somebody else put their name on it. I mean, it's very funny to say it. But that is your questionnaire where you really get into the personal, sensitive stuff. Your FBI report has to be filled out, and your financial disclosure stuff has to be filled out, even if you're not going to for confirmation, because we have to know if there's anything that's going to even conflict with somebody going to be head of the OMB or somebody that's going to be head of the national security, any even White House non-confirmation spots. And you analyze that stuff, and then you bring the people in, have an interview, and go through over the answers. And so there's a continuum of time that's used up. We didn't have it in the W. Bush. So the way we did it was I would interview somebody for the cabinet. That's how we did the cabinet. We didn't have the FBI report. We didn't have a financial disclosure. We didn't have anything. I would interview the cabinet member, potential guy. And, you know, sometimes it was 3 hours, sometimes it was 8 hours, just interviewing. And this was after there'd been a tentative selection. And, oh gosh, I can't think of the guy who I dearly love who was running the transition.
Clay Johnson?
Clay Johnson, thank you. And then I would get a call from Clay, and he'd say, okay, Smith is coming over to see you, or make arrangements to talk to Smith. And then Smith would walk into my office, and we'd spend the time that was necessary. And then he'd walk out, or she'd walk out. I'd pick up the phone and call Clay and say yes or no as to whether they were going to go to the next station in life or not. I mean, that was the only way we could do it. I had no safety net at all. I didn't have any FBI report. I didn't have anything. So it was just, you know, hoping to get it right. And then I had this team of people who then, for the confirmation stuff, then they had to go on the Hill. We had to have the stuff by then, but the decision had to be made before we had all the information. And, you know, it honestly, it sounds funny, but it worked. We only had one problem with one appointee, and it was somebody that I knew. And afterward, it came out that, well, it was Linda Chavez. And it came out that she had some sort of illegal living in her house. She was working for and was working in the neighborhood. I mean, Linda knew damn well. She knew so much better in the Department of Labor. And I asked her afterward, I said, Linda, why did you do that? She said, the night before our interview, my husband and I talked about it, and we decided we were not going to tell you about her and that you wouldn't find out. At least she was honest. I mean, she didn't say he never asked me the questions, I mean, which is what I was afraid was going to happen. But she was very honest. She said, we just did it. And I said, well, Linda, I'll tell you something. There were two things that I knew about it. I'm sorry. She said, there were two things we were not going to tell you. That was one. And afterward, and then I said, yeah, and I'll tell you what the other one was. And because I knew the other one. But that was the only time it didn't work, the system. But it was very dangerous, very risky, and you couldn't do it unless, and this sounds very braggadocious, you couldn't do it unless you had somebody who really knew what the hot spots were and knew the questions to ask and hope that people were telling you the truth. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It really does. And we actually did an extended interview with Clay Johnson. And sort of a theme through some of these is about the transition.
Yeah.
And it was such an abbreviated transition.
Right.
That maybe there's a question that it took the administration a little while to kind of get its feet under it because of this. Would you say that that's the case?
Well, yeah, it was the case, but the other problem that you had was we could do that to fill the major slots, and we could do that to fill out the White House staff, but we couldn't do it enough in time for January 20th, 21st, so that you had other people lined up to go out. And so if you had the slightest reluctance from the Hill, which we did, then you slowed up, and it's a very dangerous time. It's probably the most dangerous time from a national security point of view in our history of our republic, is that transition period where you don't have people sitting in the right spots that if something happens. And if I were ever going to attack the United States, that's when I would attack the United States. When they don't have a number 3 guy at terrorism, they don't have a number 2 person. You're vulnerable. You're very vulnerable. And you have new people.
Well, I guess that's a question that probably would come to mind. By July, I know the Bush administration is worried about possible terrorist attack.
Sure.
And, I guess some would raise that question, whether the response or the failure to catch that maybe had something to do with.
No, that's a fair question. I don't know that it did, because I was on the 9/11 Commission, and we looked at that pretty heavily. But that risk is always there, sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit about afterward. I mean, you'd been in 2 White Houses. You'd had your, unique experience among people here in the city. Successful law practice. Why would you join a 3rd White House?
You've been talking to my wife.
That was obviously in crisis. Some would say,
it wasn't crisis. That's right.
Some would say a failed White House at this point. What compels a man to do that?
When somebody says, well, first of all, I mean, it's part of it's how you grew up. I mean, to be really blunt and not be maudlin about it, it's part of it's how you grew up and what was important in your life and what was important, and what was instilled in you to be important. But also, it was when somebody asks you the question, I need to ask you a favor, and it's not for me, it's for your country. That's why you do it.
Who actually asked you? How did you come to join
That closely was asked by Josh Bolton, delivering what he said was, I have a message for you from the president. And then the president reiterated it when I first met with him. So, but in answer to your question, geez, I hadn't thought about this for a long time. I first got the phone, not the first, but when I got the phone call when Josh laid that one into me, I hung up the phone, and my wife was in the kitchen, and she said, "What's wrong?" Because I was at home. It was during Christmas, I think. And I said, "Geez," I said, "they want me to go back into the White House. The president wants me to go back into the White House." And I was just waiting for the crash bang, because my wife had told these stories for years about, it's so much fun. You go to these great parties, you're the wife of, you're sitting next to the Slobovian ambassador who doesn't speak English. Oh, it's great. It's really glamorous. I mean, she used to tell all these stories, and I thought, here it comes. And she said, God love her, she said, well, he does need help. And there you are.
So explain a little bit about the situation that you came into. There were some problems that were obviously long-term, these stalled nominations, this brewing scandal with the U.S. attorneys.
Hadn't started.
It
hadn't surfaced at all.
It hadn't surfaced at that point.
That's right.
Okay.
Probably it surfaced at the Justice Department, but it hadn't surfaced at our end.
Yeah, I believe that it actually happened there in December. You
Right.
came on just right afterwards. So what was the situation that you were walking into? What did you expect to accomplish or want to accomplish?
Well, the major problem, I suspect the reason, no, I can't say that. I suspect the major reason that they wanted to replace Harriet with someone of my background was that they had just lost both houses. Or they didn't. The Democrats had control of both houses. Waxman and his counterparts on the Democrats had announced they were going to close the White House down. That's a pretty good sign that troubles are coming, right? And so, I mean, that I figured was probably going to be the toughest challenge, was to get a hold of that situation. And also, I'm very, very fond of Harriet Miers, and what I'm about to say sounds like I'm not fond of her, and I really am, and she did a very good job. But reputationally in town, one of the broken pieces in the chatter around town about that White House was the counsel's office. No decisions could be made. I mean, it was an indecisive group of people, and they weren't serving the president well. Of course, people are saying this to me, knowing that it's my background, that's my soft spot, and everything else. So I give you that, but I think there was some fair comment that that's what the perception was, and I found out afterward that to a certain extent, that was a perception in-house within some quarters of the White House itself. And again, I can't say that that was fair or unfair, but as far as I knew in my dealings with Harriet, she was terrific and very able. And I had worked with Al Gonzalez, obviously, during the transition, and he would call me from time to time to bounce stuff off me, which made good sense. I don't know why people don't do that more often.
We haven't yet talked to Miers, but she's on our list.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It is, in some ways, really remarkable that after what she had gone through with the nomination, that she remained in the office for a good year or more.
Was it that long?
Yeah, I mean, she went through this sort of horrendous experience in late 2005, and she left at the end of 2006 or beginning 2007.
January 2007. Yeah.
So I guess that's one of the questions we'll have for her, is just if that sort of created a situation that was hard
well,
to
it
work
was
in.
a situation, and unfortunately, in I had an extended conversation with the president before I took the job. I mean, over an hour, and I was concerned because I found out that Harriet didn't know that I was being interviewed, so whatever decision making was being done, she was not aware of it, and I don't know precisely when she became aware of it, or by whom, but it hadn't been done when I was talking to the president.
Isn't that common in a White House, though, the offering the person?
Not really, because if somebody's in trouble, they usually know they're in trouble. That's right. So, even Don Regan, I think, knew. He just didn't know how mad the First Lady was at him.
So, I mean, it sounds like a very wise decision on the Bush administration's part to the most seasoned person in the city at these types of things, and you're going to be able to sit down with Democrats on the Hill who know your reputation, survive a Watergate, survive, So, and around this time, you finally got past the whole deep throat stuff.
I guess that's right. That was done, wasn't it? No, that was kind of a mystique. I used to recruit on that. No, I'm kidding you.
So,
yeah, I guess that's right.
So it's an obvious, it's a sort of a masterstroke. So then you're dropped with this scandal with the U.S. attorneys. How did you find this out, and what exactly? Maybe just as a sort of background, explain exactly what happened.
Well, the first I knew about it, there were conversations about it. Something in the press, I guess, and so I said, what is this all about? I'd asked my deputy, who was the holdover, if he knew anything about it. He said no. I said, is the White House involved in this at all? No, I don't think so. I don't know anything about it. And it just kept festering. I remember one time we were in a senior staff meeting one morning, and I just said, People's Justice Department are just not dealing with this. I don't understand what's going on. So we had a meeting, which I had to explain to 1,000 people afterward, but I had a meeting, brought them over and said, figure out why you fired these people and tell them. Don't say, it was this or that or something. It was, in other words, the Justice Department was kind of, from my view and from our view, White House view, they were just in disarray. And I had a lot of conversations then instantly with Al Gonzalez, because he was AG at the time. I said, we have to know what's going on. And he called me, and I said, it sounds to me like it's your deputy over there was the one that was causing this little program. And he called me one day and he said, I have some bad news for you. And I said, what's that? He said, we have memos from the White House about this. And I said, from who? He said, Harriet. So I called my deputy in again and I said, do you know anything about this? And I gave him the time frames. He said, no. Well, the day I gave him was one day off, but I said, have you checked your phone? Yeah, I checked it. Well, not only did he know about it, he had written one of the memos. So that was an unpleasant, because it wasn't that the White House directed anything, but they knew about it. And there was the memo that said it.
Well, I mean, the argument is that they're appointed by the president, they serve at his pleasure.
If it had been handled right the first day, it would have, that's the answer. It's the president's prerogative. Now, we didn't do what Bill Clinton did. We didn't fire the U.S. attorney in Arkansas that was investigating Whitewater without a replacement. We just made some I mean, that's the way it should have been responded. It wasn't. It just got a head of steam on it, and so by the time we got to it, it was burning. And we had no indication there'd been any White House involvement until they found the memo over there, and then my deputy finally found the memo that I'd asked him for before that. So then we had to deal with that dimension as well, which we did.
Which I think particularly the Tim Griffin nomination, because he had worked with Karl Rove, gave it the sort of aura of just naked.
Yeah, but I don't care if it is naked. It can be naked. It can be naked politics that you're removing somebody, as long as you're not removing them because they're working on a case that involves your administration. But you can't act like there's nothing wrong if there is something wrong.
So what are some of the problems that came up with this investigation? And I know that you end up negotiating with Congress as you expected, but probably over issues you probably didn't expect to deal with.
I figured we'd probably have an executive privilege fight at some point in the 2 years because it was just too ripe, But that isn't the executive privilege fight I wanted. I wanted one that really had to do with national security and everything else. And but then it was became a war of dueling letters back and forth between me and Chairman Leahy and with the House side. But kept the ball in the air till it was over. But actually, it was interesting because Henry Waxman and those folks, I went up to see them all right away, but not. I can't say hat in hand because it wasn't hat in hand. It was, if you want legitimate information, we'll give it to you. If you want to fight, we'll give it to you. We'd prefer not to, but.
What's the difference? I mean, what would one look like and the other look like? One's legitimate information. Some would argue, well, how do we know if it's legitimate?
No. I'll give you an example. I faced down Waxman by laughing at him privately, not in front of his staff, and inviting him to start the war because he had You remember Corporal Stillman? Tillman. Turned out he was killed by friendly fire.
Yeah.
They started asking for. They were doing an investigation to find out who knew it was friendly fire and when they knew it. And that's legitimate inquiry, but it can be answered as well legitimately. And then they wanted to. They discovered that the president had spoken at the Gridiron or one of these things, one of these events after Tillman was killed, but before we knew that it was friendly fire. And the president had praised him and the other brave people that were defending our country in a speech. Waxman wanted to see the president's file and the White House file on the speech. He wanted to see the original, to see if there were any changes made in that line about Tillman. And I drew the line and said, go ahead. Demand it publicly. But that's the problem. They get ahead of steam and then they step over the line of propriety in the legitimate inquiry. And there's nothing legitimate inquiry about asking for a presidential paper on the whim that he might have changed something, on the theory that he might have known that there was friendly fire and hadn't told the American public at the Gridiron dinner. Come on.
Well, this seems not sort of, it is a pattern now in the American presidency that the last 2 years are fairly disastrous. It usually comes with the loss of Congress and investigations.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what you're kind of facing. I mean, what's your goal? I mean, I know you're trying to, particularly in that fight, you have.
My goal was to keep the Bush administration operating and let them function and let them. The other problem that we had, and when the control changed, especially in the House, the other problem we had was that there had been a serious diminution of executive power in the Clinton administration, especially in dealing with the White House and the presidential papers, to the point where at one point he permitted his counsel of the president, was directed to go up and testify and give documents. And so, of course, the Henry Waxmans of the world, they had a whole list of all this stuff that had been done. This was the precedent. It's not what you say it is, Mr. Fielding. This is the precedent for executive privilege. And we're pulling it back. We were trying to pull it back, trying to get it back to where I thought it, or not me, but where we thought it should be.
Well, and I think Vice President Cheney has been pretty, just honest about this was a goal when they came in. And I assume it's from this perception that, or reality.
Yeah, that's
that
right.
Executive power.
That's right. That's right. And that was one of the things that the President and I talked about when I was interviewing or being interviewed for the job. Although, God love him, the President was great. He said, "Oh, wait a minute." He said, "I want you to know something." He said, You're not interviewing the job. I'm interviewing the job today." He said, I want you to do this. So he said, he was really super.
Well, let's go back to
we're all off. I'm sorry.
No, this is great. The judicial nominations, which there were still several that were stalled at this point. You're 6 years into a battle, and it seems like the White House pretty successful in actually filling the court. But what was the state of those nominations in the last 2 years, and what were the hopes of actually getting action on those, and how did you actually address those?
Well, I'm sorry, I'd have to go back and refresh myself on the individual cases. I just know that I was trying very hard and discuss with the president what I wanted to do, which was at least fill as many of the circuits as we could. And again, break these deadlocks. We had one in Virginia, for instance, that it didn't make any sense to have it. So try to get John Warner enlisted, and Warner would give us a name of somebody that the White House didn't want, but Warner thought he could, make the deal to get it done. Well, that's fine, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to fill the slots, but not fill them with people that we didn't want to fill them with. And but I'd have to go back and look at it. I mean, your analysis is my memory, and that's that we just wanted to fill as many as we could, and to break as many log jams as we could.
Well, I guess maybe just in a general question, is the process, does the process work anymore? I mean, it seems like, particularly if it's highly politicized, that maybe the system doesn't work. We do hear a lot about, the crisis in the judiciary with unfilled seats. How's that solved?
Well, it's solved by politics, and by politics I mean, if you have a crisis, and the crisis is because you can't fill positions, the most political way to get that job done is to have the American public be outraged by it. Because they can withstand a lot up on the Hill, but they can't withstand that. So that's one of the ways you do it. The other way is that you swap. I mean, if somebody related to Senator Levin, hypothetically, wants a federal district court judge, and she is otherwise qualified, but was blocked because she's a little more liberal, but she's still qualified, she's just more liberal than anyone. Well, if you can break a logjam by suddenly having somebody like that be acceptable on the district court, and you break a logjam in the circuit court, that's how it's done too.
Well, there's something almost counterintuitive to all this, in that when you're picking a nominee, you supposedly can't ask them about, how they would rule on certain decisions.
That's right, how they would rule on certain things.
But we also want them to have a record.
And you're entitled to look at their record.
And so it lends itself to this, you don't want someone who's untested or someone who has no record.
Eisenhower never knew that Warren was liberal. I mean, this happens. People misjudge.
Well, sure. And yesterday we were talking to Mr. Gray, who talked about vetting Souter, and and he says he did have a record.
Yeah,
he had a record on the state court, but of course, he hadn't ruled on some of the issues that he would deal with. So,
right, and also there was somebody very powerful urging him on, and it was a mistake.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean it was just a mistake.
So there's a sphere of nominating a Souter, and from what you read, particularly hostility toward a Gonzalez nomination. Was sort of met with this kind of joke that Gonzalez was Spanish for Souter. You don't want someone who has this kind of.
Ooh, I hadn't heard that.
So it seems actually it seems miraculous that as many people actually get through the process when you think about it.
Yeah, and a lot of it is circumstance. A lot of it is timing. But a lot of it's also control of the Senate, but the thing that I've always found repugnant and I think is the biggest fault in our system is that politics has to play a part at all. You would like to think that it's a lofty thing, and that's above, and it's not. I mean, it's politics. That, and the other thing that I think is done, it's finished, is the old theory that people, when they have a lifetime of service to the bar, in their end of their service, a goal is to give back by sitting on the bench and justice. And with the emphasis now on lifetime tenure, get people in as young as we can, you've lost that.
Yes.
Because the average age of judges keeps going down and down and down.
Well,
And the consequence of that is that also you're having something you never had before, which is that somebody becomes a judge and then they resign.
in our conversation with Mr. Gray, but also other sources, they now sort of focused on that while we have, for instance, a very diverse Supreme Court in one way, it's actually not very diverse. They all go to the same law schools. They have the same type of experiences. Most of them are judges. So the days, like yesterday we were talking about President Clinton, who really considered nominating Governor Cuomo to the court.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there's any way something like that would even fly. If not then, even now. So what's this do to the court itself? Do we have a court that is really not diverse as we think it is?
Well, it's the emphasis on diversity is a different emphasis on different kind of diversity. It has nothing. I mean, you're getting chameleons in a certain extent, but they're different colors and they're different ethnic backgrounds and they're different religions and it is but they all come from the same place, so to speak. But I mean, that doesn't bother me as much as the business about age, because there's a certain wisdom that people acquire, and they're much less political, if you will, if the selection was of the senior people of the profession who then go back and serve, and that's what they're doing. But I mean, it's changed. It's the way it is.
Oh, I guess this is some of the things you hear about Justice Roberts and the Affordable Care Act decision. It says that it was an overt political kind of decision. I mean, we don't know that, probably never will, but that he's young enough and he's got quite a bit of a future on the court. Maybe I know there's some level of protection of the court, and seeing that it was coming under attack, maybe that's an explanation.
I can't really comment on that because I've talked to John about it.
I've heard that one before. So, all right. Well, let's talk about those.
I hired him.
Right.
So
right.
He and Mike Ludig were both in my group in the Reagan years. Boy, was that exciting! These kids are so smart, and everybody's got this wild sense of humor, and they're pulling tricks on each other all the time, and sending dummy memos to each other. And then you wait for them to come out at the hearings of what does this memo mean?
So you had Roberts and Ludig. So you have the Chief Justice and the real alternative to his nomination,
exactly.
Both working for you.
Yeah, at the same time.
So well, let's talk, if you will, about the end of the Bush administration, and probably the thing that you've been asked about the most, and that's the issue of pardons.
Mm-hmm.
You've been through this with other presidents, and we've talked to a few other people, and first of all, maybe explain exactly what the process should be, what is intended by a pardon, and then maybe talk about President Bush's pardon.
Well, the pardon power is the unlimited power the president has to make those decisions, and the best you can do is give him, if you're a staff person, is give him your thoughts, your advice, and your perspective on the relative merits or demerits of people that are coming. And for Bush's situation, and any president, but especially somebody who's as gregarious as President Bush was, I mean, he can go to the nicest reception in the world, and it's completely off the record, and it's old friends from Texas and all, and somebody's going to whisper and grab him by the elbow and say, hey, you got to pardon such and such, he's a good old boy. I mean, it's awful, but it happens, and especially with somebody that's as accessible as President Bush was. And I used to feel really bad because he'd come in after being in Texas especially, he'd come back and say, will you check on such and such and find out what this is all about or something like that. He never said, do this. I mean, he was very respectful of the power and wanted to get it right. And there were some people that he was very fond of that did not get pardons because he was advised that that wasn't appropriate. By the same token, it just drove him crazy that he was besieged all the time. And when he started to write his memoirs, he then got really annoyed about the whole process. But I really think that was where it started to just gel in his mind that the process was unfair. Up to that point, it was just, and of course, we're only talking about a year and a half type. But up to that point, it was just becoming an increasing aggravation. And it was something we discussed and I warned him about in our initial conversation because I said, the last year, you're going to get hit. And I don't know if I should name the Michael Milkins of the world are going to be, they're going to have friends that you have no idea know Michael Milken are going to come out of the woodwork. And of course, that's what happened. And the elephant in the living room, of course, is Scooter Libby, who that was a tough one for him.
Well, explain a little bit about the Libby pardon. I guess, I mean, his sentence had been commuted. How did that come about? And what was your role in that?
My role in that was that I recommended a commutation. People wanted him to be pardoned right then. And I recommended that he not be pardoned. And I'll tell you, I don't know how you deal with this. I'm bothered by answering some of these questions because they relate to conversations I've had with the president. I'm really not.
Anything you don't want to answer?
I'm really not comfortable with that. Let me just say this about the Libby thing. If there's someone to blame for the box that the president was told he was in by the press, let me put it that way, and that in his commutation of Scooter Libby, the statement that he made it very, very difficult for him to do anything more. And I wrote that. That's all I'm going to say about it.
Well, I mean, this obviously bothered President Bush, the whole pardon issue, in that I think Peter Baker has reported that the one piece of advice he gave President Obama on the ride to the Capitol was to have an established pardon policy.
Well, part of the problem that we had was that he wanted to exercise, but he did not want to be a meager participant in the pardon process. And we couldn't get the pardon attorney's office to send over recommendations for pardons. Well, when I first got there was a huge backlog of pardons. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of things that were just sitting there. Most of them were requests for commutations, recommendations for denial, and almost uniformly they were mandatory sentence drug people that just said it's not fair, the sentence is too long. I mean, it was almost a cookie cutter of it. And none of those were getting granted because there was no basis other than universally this wasn't fair. And there were hundreds of those. But I even at one point personally called the pardon attorney and told I told the Attorney General I was going to do it, but I called him directly and said, you've got to send us some recommendations. Well, we're only sending the ones that we think. I said, okay, but you've got to get on this because the president really wants to see. He will make the decisions, but he really wants to see if there are any that are. Because I thought that I didn't want them to think that he didn't want pardons. I want him to know that he wanted to pardon people if they were worthy of being pardoned. Well, of course, now it's turned out after the fact that that whole office was screwed up, and badly screwed up. There's a gal named, what's her name, Daphne Linsner, has written a lot on this, and she's right on. She really got into it. But so he wanted pardons, and we just couldn't get them, couldn't get numbers of them. But the people that were petitioning, we had to go outside of, I guess the other thing is, the question is, do you go outside of the system? Do you go outside the pardon attorney system if it isn't producing? And for the most part, every president does it. Don't get me wrong. This is not just a Bill Clinton invention. Every president does it. But you involve the Justice Department to the extent that they will be involved, that they're willing to be. But I mean, even Ronald Reagan, God, he went out of his way. He found out that Marvin Mandel had been denied. He was asking for a commutation. He was asking for a pardon because the Bureau of Prisons review kept denying his request for release, early release. And we found out that Jimmy Carter had crossed lines with Marvin Mandel when they were both governors, and Carter had directed them not to let him out. And so we went right over everybody's head, and we didn't give him a pardon, but we commuted his sentence, so he was out consistent with every guideline in the world except Carter's direction. But I mean, that was an example of just going outside of the system. But there were an awful lot of people that President Bush really had exercised a lot of courage and personal courage, because they were people that were very close to him. Number one, wanted pardons, or number two, were urging pardons for others. And of course, the I guess annual request for the Israeli spy, whose name I can't think of right now. It's Pollard, yeah. I mean, even some very prominent former White House senior staff people came to me about Pollard. And he wasn't about to do that. Mike Milken was another example.
Well, let me ask you a question in this vein. I mean, it's the president's unlimited power.
Unlimited total, yeah.
But who deserves a presidential pardon? What's the guidelines for someone who...
It's the president's prerogative. Are you asking me what the guidelines are? If the president asks me what are the guidelines, I mean... Yeah,
I guess on one level, yeah. What are the guidelines? But
well, the guidelines are that they're people who not people that said professed innocence. No, that's not it. It's people that have accepted, paid their dues to society, and have done something remarkable in their lives since then. And I mean remarkable. Some of them have done things that were good, not only paid their dues by putting in incarceration, paying fines or whatever, but have lived lives that are exemplary after that, and ones that people would admire, and say he or she's rehabilitated. That would be my guidelines. Not because somebody knows somebody. And also, some of it has to do with the offense for which they committed. I mean, it's harder to just outwardly deny somebody who does something when they're 18 and 80, when they're 80, has lived a terrific life and put kids through school and set up a boys' club or something. I mean, it's pretty hard to say, nah. But if somebody's done something pretty heinous, and the other thing is, I wouldn't advise this, but I don't think it helps people seeking pardons to really drum up high-level, high-pressure petitions to the president, because it smacks of something else. It smacks of favoritism, political favoritism, personal relationship favoritism, and that usually doesn't redound to the president's favor, and I don't think that was the purpose of it.
Well, just as a way to kind of maybe start wrapping up, I know we have running out of time.
I have no idea.
But I mean,
we've been rolling, haven't we?
You've worked for 3 presidents. Could you maybe give us a general assessment on those presidents and maybe how the presidency's changed since you've?
I want to grade the presidents. I'm kidding. They're so different. I mean, Richard Nixon was so aloof and strange when I worked there. And some of what you look about Nixon is after acquired reflection too. No kidding. But Nixon was brilliant. It's a tragedy of our historic proportions that he got himself into the Watergate thing, because he had a side to him. Obviously now we know he had a side to him that was just angry and defensive, and he surrounded himself with people who played to that side, because it was the bully boys. We all got together and told tough stories to each other, type of thing. And his rigidity of his staff model basically cut off the other thoughts, or cut off access to other thoughts, instead of playing to this, which is a character weakness that he had, and otherwise brilliant, politically savvy mind. For example, I worked on a reorganization of the executive branch at the end of the first term that would have revolutionized the operation of the executive branch and would have replaced a strict cabinet government, which has failed in all recent years. Everybody acknowledges cabinet government doesn't operate the way cabinet government used to, because now you have a White House staff that grew up in order to replace what cabinet government, I think, theoretically was supposed to do. But anyway, it was phenomenally a smart idea, and it was to break the cabinet into different constituencies. And there were 4 cabinet members that were going to have offices on each of the 4 corners of the old executive office building. And they were really, then there would be a sub-cabinet. And it was a revolutionary reorganization of government and a diminution of the interest of the White House staff per se into this. Never got off the ground because of Watergate. It was all written up, the plans, everything. And it's sad. And if you look at some of the stuff that Nixon did, OEO, and things, there are things he could have done and gotten away with politically that others couldn't have, because it was counterintuitive to what he was supposed to be, as a conservative philosophic, but he did good, smart things. And he attracted whole generations of people that are still operating. The congressional relations people on the Republican side, all of them, up until the last years and until Bush, really, they were all graduates of the Nixon groups that come in. We had very interesting people in there. Father John McLaughlin, the Jesuit priest, was a speechwriter with Pat Buchanan and people like that. I mean, it was a phenomenally interesting staff of people. There were a bunch of us that were young lawyers there, and there was one guy that he was part of our group, even though he wasn't a lawyer, because he worked for Don Rumsfeld, and his name was Dick Cheney. I mean, it was an interesting group of people. Okay, but it was a failed presidency because of character failures, I guess is what you say.
You said you didn't have a lot of contact in the presidency, but did you ever talk to Nixon afterward? In any of those?
Yeah, I did, and we had exchanges of letters afterward. And I was assigned to help Dan Quayle after the election, during the election, after the election, because you remember Quayle during the election. He was almost like deer in the headlights all the time. And afterward, after the election, there was a day when he and Marilyn were on television, and it was over. He was vice president of the United States. He hadn't been sworn in, but he was over. And they asked him some question, and he did the same thing. Oh, and Marilyn Quayle was on, and she was great, but Marilyn Quayle and my wife physically resemble each other. And so when I would go to the receptions and Marilyn would be there waiting for Dan, she used to go through the line with me. And we did, and she was my wife. And we had a lot of fun together. But she asked me also to come and help out with Dan. So after that day, I took him in. And there's a reason for the Shaggy Dog story. But I went and I got a film clip of him debating a jobs bill on the floor of the Senate against Benson. And there's Benson reading his debate notes. Quayle comes in, he's like Robert Redford. He doesn't have a note in front of him, he's bumming, he's effective, and it was terrific. They had both these film clips. So I went and I turned out the lights and said, hey, I'm going to watch some movies. And I played that film clip. Then I played back his performance that morning on the news show. And then I played the film clip and went back and forth and flicked on the lights. And I said, which one? And I figured that would really, snap him. It didn't at all. So the reason I'm getting to this, so I asked Nixon to come down and visit with him. And they spent some time together because Nixon had been the vice president and, and all this stuff. So, and Nixon was very accommodating, very obliging to do that and everything. That didn't work. Anyway, but it's a long Shaggy Dog story to answer your question. Then Reagan, of course, Reagan was Reagan. I mean, it was just like you think he was, like you'd like to think he was. He was terrific. I mean, he was accessible, but the chief of staff guarded the door and kept him. But he it was fun because he knew what he wanted to do, and he didn't have the malady that most politicians have, and that they've changed positions over the years and they've done things and said things. I mean, Ronald Reagan knew what he said. He kind of felt the way he always felt as he matured as in his political thinking, and so he didn't suffer that problem. And the other thing was he didn't worry about who was using the White House tennis courts and stuff like that Jimmy Carter liked to worry about. I mean, there were a couple things he wanted to accomplish, and he set out to accomplish them. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, and it was enjoyable to be with him. By the same token, his serious side was very serious, and there were a couple things that he was always concerned about, and one of them was, which fell into my ambit, was he never wanted to do anything without realizing the impact it would have on his successors and on the institution of the presidency. He was very, very conscious of that, which you wouldn't think he would be. George W. Bush was too. Yeah. But you expect that of him because of the way he grew up and his dad and and today's Amelia. But Ronald Reagan was very much so. And but it was just an enjoyable person to work with, easy client, knew what he wanted. You go up, if a problem came up, you'd go up to the residents and talk to him. You walk in, you go up in the elevator. God, I remember one time we went over and we were talking about something. It was the end of the day. He said, come on, walk me over to the residence. As we were talking, and we got to the elevator, and he said, no, come on. He kept talking. We went up in the elevator. Door opens. and we're just wrapping it up. And he goes, "Hi, Mommy." And I hear this voice, "Hi, Daddy." And then he said, "Fred's with me, but we'll only be a minute, Mommy." And I'm thinking, if the Russians are listening now, they're trying to figure out what code this is. But he's very good. George W. Bush, as I hope you've had exposure to him. He's such a pleasant and interesting guy. He's smart as he can be. He had much better political judgment than most of the people that we tried to help him with. And he really was. He's very smart. He's very kind, very thoughtful to people. And I'm just giving you personal observations of him. Let me give you an example. He spent huge amounts of time in his presidency. First of all, signing all the, pictures and stuff, personally signing them. I used to go in the morning, he'd call me over at 6:45 in the morning. He want to talk about something he thought about overnight. He's there signing pictures and stuff. Because he had to budget his time, so he'd do it personally, not the auto pen or anything. But whenever anybody left the White House staff, he had them in to say goodbye, and he had them in with their families.
We've heard this from several of the people that we've interviewed.
Did you hear about the end, though?
No.
He wants everybody to sprint to the finish, right? And we're talking about that, and I said, "What are you going to do about the pictures?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, if everybody's sprinting to the finish, they're not leaving until then. Their prize for sprinting to the finish is they don't get the exit photo." He set out, I forget it was a Thursday or whatever it was, every week. It had everybody that was left that was going to stay for the last 3 or 4 months, had them in.
Oh.
Come on, that's really being thoughtful and really taking the extra time. And so they had special, dinners for the senior staff, and really thoughtful part. You were going to ask me something.
Well, when you're talking about the race to the finish, we've had Peter Baker down to talk, and it really seems like that President Bush was really conscious about, preserving, the presidential power, but also reversing things that he considered to be, missteps or mistakes, and trying to not leave serious problems for his.
That's right. And he instructed us. There was no question. First of all, I was not in the White House, but I heard all the shenanigans stories about what the White House was like when the Clinton people left, and, the W's on the processors and that kind of stuff. But I'll bet you I know a story you don't know. In my office, I had 7 phones. Okay, every phone in the White House, the West Wing, goes into a plug, and the plug is unique to that phone. Okay, every phone is unique. All the phones are in a big pile in one room. That's dangerous. That's not even funny. It's dangerous. But he didn't. But anyway, long story short, he didn't mention that. But he said no shenanigans, none of this. We're going to do this, and we're going to have the best transition ever. And we all worked for a long time with our successors. I had Greg Craig in, and spent a lot of time. I brought Steve Hadley in to sit with him, and we talked. And I said, the irony is, I said, look, the one thing that you should know is that your guy is really out front on Guantanamo, closing Guantanamo. I said, part of your job should be to pull him back from that, because it's really not as easy as you think. And I said, even in the last couple of months, they even threw it at me to see if there was something I could come up with on it. And I said, so you really got to do your guy a favor and pull him back till you can sort through this. And I even brought Steve Hadley in to talk about it. First day, what does he do? Executive order, going to close Guantanamo. But it wasn't because we didn't warn him. I'm using that as the illustration. Excuse me. So I don't know where you want to go with that, but that is what he instructed us, and everybody worked pretty hard at it.
Well, I'm really out of time, but I want to give you a chance if there's anything you want to add or say.
I'm fine.
So-
If there's anything you think about later, another aspect you want to talk about.
I didn't ask you why you won't write a book, so maybe later.
Actually, I'm not sure that lawyers should write books. I really just not sure about that. I'd like to record for my family, for my kids, so that they would know some of the things that I found instructive in my life, and some of the laughs that I've had, and some of the scares that I've had. But it's pretty hard to.
Well, speaking as a historian,
Yeah.
I mean, you really do have unique experience, probably more experience in how the executive branch is developed.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably important that there is a record for people to understand.
It's a commercial. I'm
changes.
getting a commercial. Well, I'm flattered. I'm flattered. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.